It's not actually coffee, but if I drink any more, it'll be a bad idea. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening, despite the heat and the monsoon. Is this our first monsoon? I think it is, right. So that means it's going to rain and wind and just generally make a mess here in Phoenix. But we are here to talk to Joe Kanon, one of my favorite authors and actually favorite people, about his new novel, Shanghai. So Joe and I have been together since Los Alamos, haven't we?
Since the first. This is the 11th book, and I've been at Poison Pen for each one.
You have, that's right. Los Alamos, I can remind you who are here, was the Edgar winner. And did you feel like there was a surge of interest in Los Alamos during the Barbieheimer or Oppenheimer?
Yeah, there was. Um, Oppenheimer was very much in the news, and it so happens that the biographer is a friend of mine, Kai Bird, so we were frequently asked to do such conversations as these tonight about Oppenheimer himself and what that was like, and was the movie accurate, which it was, I think, by the way. I liked it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And you get in the wake of that.
Isn't it interesting how sometimes, it's particularly fortuitous if a movie like that comes out relatively close to publication, for example. But in this case, it's been, how many years has it been to Los Alamos?
1997.
Has it really? Yeah, well, you're not a book a year guy, are you?
Well, there have been 11 books. I feel half tired thinking about it, but
Right.
we'll go for an even dozen or a baker's dozen.
I love it. Right. So one of the things that I particularly have always enjoyed about Joe's books is that he really picks up the destinations. He's traveled to most of them. When he was writing Istanbul Passage, I happened to write to him by accident one day. It's one of our mutually favorite cities, isn't it?
Yeah, love it.
So he's sitting at the Istanbul Modern Art Museum, which is a place that I've also had lunch. And we talked about it. Over the years, while I love all your books, I thought Istanbul Passage, in many ways, is the book that I have found the most interesting and gone back to, because nobody really talks very often about what happened when the war ended, and people were just like left all of a sudden to figure out their lives, figure out how to get home. What drew you to that topic?
I was so fascinated by the city itself and wanted to know more about, like any tourist, you fall in love with the place, and it's not unusual. Practically everybody who goes falls in love with it. But it seemed to me that when you read the guidebooks, that all the information would stop at Ataturk, and you would, the 1920s, 1930s was about as far as they would go. And I thought, so what happened during the war, which was the period that had always interested me? And looked into it and started reading about it and discovered that it was, 20 kilometers from the hot war that was going on all the time, but was a neutral capital, which meant that it was an ideal listening post. And I came across a scene that was described at the Park Hotel, which was then the Chic Hotel. Now it's a parking garage. But then it had Bosphorus views, and it had a bar. And everyone in the bar was working for one intelligence agency or another. There was the German, the Japanese, the Brit, the American. And I thought, my God, this is the real Casablanca. This is what it was like for real. And it then occurred to me, what happens when it's over? When all of that enticing energy that was being poured into this, and just the general excitement, all of these people were on the, quote, front lines, and now they weren't anywhere, and no one knew what they had done, and they were either going to return home to America to a bureaucratic job, so that all of that sort of corrupt glamour of the Casablanca bar was over. And I thought, nobody talks about what happens after they leave on the plane. What's it like in Casablanca once everybody goes off? And that's how that started.
I thought part of it was interesting, too, that for many people, their whole life had been the war for several years, and there really wasn't any concept of what they would do. There wasn't often even any real provision for getting them home, was there?
No, and our protagonist was a businessman who had been used by the American intelligence community and he found it exciting. It made him somebody that he never had been before. And now that work is going to go away, and he's stuck with his life again. And that turns out to be not exactly what he'd had in mind all these years. But I don't want to give away what happens to him.
No,
But
no, no. It's a book that I recommend to people because it's a different kind of a war story, the way that it works out.
it also had, just to stay on Istanbul for a second, it had one of those lines that I think define the work and operate as a kind of skeleton key to some of the other works as well. And somebody had pointed it out to me that I hadn't deliberately put it in. But there's a scene in which one character says to the other, "What do you do when there's no good thing to do? Just the bad thing, or one version of that, the least harmful effect." I think we're confronted with situations like that all the time. So it became, for me, a way of explaining how some of the other books were functioning as well. Your moral choices are not always what you would hope them to be. Sometimes they're about bad people.
They're sometimes about bad people. I found the most interesting thing, we're digressing to Istanbul, and then we'll get back on topic here, is that we often, looking at the First World War from a Western perspective, we think about Gallipoli and the terrible things that happened there. And I was actually in New Zealand on the, what was it, anniversary? Must have been the 100th anniversary. Must have been 2017, right? Wasn't that it?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
so. And they were having a whole Anzac thing going on. And yet I realized, having been to Istanbul several times, that this is really the birth of modern Turkey. This is when Ataturk became the George Washington of Turkey. This is when really the Ottoman Empire fell. And so, while from a Western perspective, Gallipoli was a true wartime tragedy and derailed Churchill for years, although I don't really think it was his fault. For Turkey, it was sort of like Valley Forge and, a whole different thing. One of the great things I think about traveling to other countries or reading books like Joe that take you to other countries is you get to a whole different perspective, not just our perspective, from a Western point of view, but, from another. And I think you do that really well in all your books. I've used them for guides to other places. I mean, when I went to Germany, the thing I most wanted to do was to go down to, I'm going to go blank out, where the bridge is. And
the Glienicke Bridge.
thank you. Yes, right. And what's the castle? The palace there.
Down
It's
in
Potsdam. Yeah,
Yep,
thank
down
you.
in
I couldn't.
It's
Sorry,
where they had all the spy exchanges.
it's a function of being
So-
83, as you know. I just can't remember names sometimes. But I mean, I deliberately. Now you can just take. You can go down from the Hotel Adler and get on the,
Yeah.
on the train and rocket off to Potsdam. But it was from reading Joe, that I wanted to go to Potsdam and wanted to go to the bridge. And
It's the Bridge of Spies, and in fact, there's a picture of me in my screensaver that has me on the Glienicke Bridge. So,
that's it.
Yeah,
Right. And who knew that there was a whole Russian village there and all that other stuff?
yeah. All fascinating.
It is.
Another city we have in common, Berlin.
We do.
Yeah.
And we've been to Venice with you. We've been all over. So here we are in Shanghai in the late 1930s. What a volatile place it was.
Everything was happening at this point. Shanghai had never been a quiet city. It was one of those things that mushroomed up. I don't know how many people know about its history, and this isn't a history lesson, so I'll just do it in a minute or two, and if you already know it, you can zone out and come back in when we talk about something else. But I was originally drawn to it because, as a tourist, all the things that most tourists do are enjoyable. The soup dumplings and the wonderful Bund buildings. That's the riverfront that really still looks the way it looked in the 20s and 30s. And represents a kind of aspirational Western orientation for China, and indeed still does. I mean, you can walk along it at night. These are the standard things. I had also read in one book about a Jewish community of refugees who had landed in Shanghai in the late 30s and who had settled in Hongqiu, one of the district neighborhoods that's not far from the center, and that a museum was being created to honor them. The synagogue that they had used has become an actual museum to this diaspora. There's bakeries and a building that looked the way it might have looked when Chusan Road was called Little Vienna. And it turned out that there was this whole thriving community of Central European, German, and Viennese, Austrian Jews who had escaped the Holocaust by coming to Shanghai. And I thought, who knew? This was all interesting to me because I had not heard this story before. And I thought, well, maybe it's not so interesting, but indeed it was. I think it was extraordinary. And the great question, therefore, is why would they do this? Why would they go to Shanghai, the other end of the world? The obvious answer, there was nowhere else to go. And after Kristallnacht in November 38, if you were living in Germany or Austria, this vast pogrom that the Nazis had set fire to the country and smashed windows, which is how the Kristallnacht becomes the name for it. After this, it was perfectly clear to all the people living there that it was not just going to be an anti-discriminatory and harsh regime, it was going to be a violent and murderous one, that you could die if you were a Jew and you stayed in Germany. And so people were now desperate to get out and would do anything. The problem was there was nowhere to go. No one would take them. No visas were being offered. If you wanted to go to America, there was years and years of waiting list. People would line up at the consulate offices in Berlin, anything just to get a passport to get out. Even the Dominican Republic, which was famously corrupt and was selling visas on practically through the side door, finally was persuaded not to do this, that they'd be thrown out of Berlin if they did. So they were stuck. You had to buy and then the rumor hit all over town almost all at once that you could go to Shanghai. In Shanghai, you could land without any landing papers, without an entrance visa. You can just get off the boat and be there. Why would this be the case? And here we come back to that 2-minute history lesson that I wanted to do. It's a political loophole, an anomaly, one of those rare things in history that was lucky for the people who came. There were some 18,000, or in some field that maybe as many as 20,000 Jews who escaped Europe and saved themselves from the Holocaust by coming to Shanghai. They were able to do this because even though it was technically Chinese territory, in fact, the Chinese did not have active sovereignty to it. What had happened 100 years earlier is that in order for Britain and America and some of the other Western powers to trade in opium, which they wanted to do in China as a way of A, making a vast sum of money, but B, ironically enough, balancing the trade imbalance. It turned, the Brits were buying all the tea in China and a lot of the silk and a lot of the porcelain and everything, and they were spending fortunes. But the Chinese were not buying anything from the Brits. The Brits decided that the one thing they might be able to sell or could persuade people to buy was opium, and they were right. The Chinese...
Also remember that they were in Afghanistan at the time.
So they could make a triangle. They picked the poppies, they would send them to India to be refined, from India onto mainland China, where this vast market awaited them. There was a fortune to be made, and in fact a fortune was made. But before that, the Chinese government, the teetering Qing dynasty, said, no, of course you mustn't do that, you'll enslave the people. And they said, well, we're going to do it. Gunboats are sent, and something called the Opium War is waged, which is won by Britain. And from 1842 on, there was an agreement between the two governments to set up 5 treaty ports. These were land concessions that were given to Western business people where they could live and conduct business. And even though it remained Chinese, the land, they would also be responsible for running these concessions. What this meant, there was also an extraordinary condition to this as part of the treaty called extraterritoriality, which essentially meant that they were not subject to the laws of the Chinese and could only be tried in the courts of their own native countries, which effectively meant that they weren't tried at all. And it also was the beginning of Shanghai's reputation as playing fast and loose with the law. There were several concessions. You could escape prosecution in one simply by crossing the street to another because there would be a different police setup. Clearly, this was not going to work. So, Britain, America, and I think 8 or 9 others got together and united and formed what then became the International Settlement. The French did not join. They kept their own concession, still on maps called the French Concession, and is now the chic part of Shanghai in which to live. There are wonderful avenues of plane trees and French villas and upscale restaurants, and very nice it is too. And the International Settlement is now central Shanghai. So you can see what it all had been like. And I thought, but how extraordinary that this should have existed. It did not last forever. The window of opportunity here was about almost a year. But they came, all 20,000 of them. And I thought, so what did they find? In order to come, you had to be able to afford a ticket out of Germany, usually on a Lloyd Triestino liner, one of the big shipping firms. You had to surrender your passport, which was invalidated anyway at this point if you were Jewish, and you had to give up everything you owned. You were allowed 10 Reichsmarks out, which was a few dollars, $5 or $6. Everything else was confiscated by the Nazis, including any assets you may have tried to hide abroad. They would ferret them out and get them. You couldn't sneak away with your jewelry sewn into clothing because they knew exactly where to look for that sort of thing. You therefore, after 3 weeks of travel to quite literally the other side of the world, would arrive stateless, penniless, without marketable skills, without language, without even an alphabet that was the same. You know, you would arrive at the riverfront and see this paragon of a Western trading city with all of its banks and Art Deco hotels, etc. And you thought it would look familiar, except it was swarming with coolies pulling rickshaws and all of the exoticism that you might have seen in a movie, but not what you were expected to live by if you were one of these people. So what happened to them and what did they do? That a very long-winded answer, I'm afraid, to that question of why
it's a
would they
very comprehensive
be there?
answer. Of course, what they didn't actually see was the Japanese, although they should have, because the rape of Nanking was what, 1935, right up
37.
37, was
yeah.
it? So there is, in fact, because every good novel has to have an antagonist. There's the evil Colonel Yamada, but you know, I think that it was so. These people were so desperate to escape the Nazis, they didn't really think ahead to what the Japanese might be poised to do to them.
Well, it's a very odd thing about the Japanese. In this particular instance, what happened was they had early in the 30s taken Manchuria, and then in the late 30s, which was effectively the beginning of World War II, they invaded coastal and central China. The rape of Nanjing happened then, and all the incredible atrocities that were attributed to that invasion. And they won. They had a puppet Chinese government that was running things on their behalf. But they stopped short of the international settlement in Shanghai. They completely surrounded the city. They had all of the outer suburbs, and in fact some of the inner neighborhoods were under the Chinese, and that is to say the Japanese control. But they did not cross the line into the settlement. And part of the reason for this was that in 1937, 8, 9, which is when all this is happening, they weren't yet prepared to take on the British Empire or the Americans. They were not looking to go to war in a way which was assumed to be fatal for them because they were by no means ready for it. So they stopped. Even though this was not Britain or America running a colony, because they had foreign nationals living there, it would have been seen as a provocation, and the Japanese were being very cagey and said, okay, the last thing we want is to open another area of World War III here. So they let it be. What this meant was that there was an almost surreal sense of being an island in the middle of otherwise a really violent occupational military situation. During the war itself, there were scenes of Westerners going to rooftop bars at some of their hotels and actually watching parts of the city being shelled, and as if it were a fireworks demonstration. It was, interesting to see. But it contributed to this feeling that nothing is going to happen to us, that somehow we are going to go on in this very special way that we have. We are not like everybody else. And nobody's going to come in and take over the city. It would have taken approximately 45 minutes for the Japanese to completely take over all of Shanghai. There were no real defenses for it. But they didn't. And consequently, this extraordinary place kept going. And it kept going with not only the Jews we were talking about, but the Chinese themselves, who became refugees from their own war and would cross over into the international settlement so that they could find a refuge, some peace. I find that even so, the attitude was really complicated. One of the questions that has frequently come up about this is the Japanese attitude to these Jewish refugees, and why did they allow them in? The international settlement was run by the Shanghai Municipal Council, which was essentially a city board of some rich businessmen whose only real interest was keeping everything going the way it was. And they weren't practiced in acts of state. They weren't making rules about immigration and things of that sort. That sort of secret directive would have come from the Japanese. But it didn't. And why didn't it? It turns out that among the many theories, one that I think is probably obvious is that the Axis alliance was never as strong as the Atlantic alliance. It was an axis of convenience, mostly to pin down Russia. But one of the things that Japan never truly appreciated, of course, was the Nazi race theory, since they themselves had been discriminated by race. Hitler said that we were going to make them honorary Aryans, but you can imagine how well that went down with them. So consequently, if there was a lot of pressure to do something about your, quote, Jewish problem, there was also a lot of pushback. First them and then us. Is that your idea? So there was an immediate reaction to that. But there was something else even more peculiar, and which speaks to how opaque some of that culture was to us at the time, and how the decision making in Japan was really very different from somewhere else. It turns out that during the Russian-Japanese War in 1905, among the reasons that the Japanese prevailed, and it was their first victory against a Western power, was that loans had been arranged in America by Kuhn Loeb and some of the houses on Wall Street, and in particular by Jacob Schiff, who was then working at Kuhn Loeb. And he had arranged for a big military assistance aid package to go over, which they claimed had them win the war. It was one of the reasons they could prevail over the Russians. The Japanese felt this very sort of wonderfully Japanese sense of honor and obligation for this act. And they also began to believe in the same propaganda line that was being put out by Sturmer and Goebbels, that the Japanese controlled the money in America, and not the Japanese, the Jews controlled the money in America and had Roosevelt's ear. In other words, they themselves became believers in the Nazi propaganda that was completely ridiculous and had no real basis in fact. But we now know, because we've seen documents to this effect, is that there were several decision makers who were in a position to do something about it in Tokyo who said, no, we must protect these people. We must never do anything that would put them in harm's way, because A, they have helped us in the past, but B, they'll help us in the future. They have FDR's ear. We have to buy their goodwill. That may or may not have been the ultimate determinant factor, but the fact is that they didn't do anything to stop Japanese immigration. what what effectively stopped it. I keep saying Japanese when I mean Jewish. They didn't stop the Jewish immigration, and even after Pearl Harbor, when there was no longer any question at all that these people were in a vulnerable position, they did not put them in a ghetto-like community until spring 1943. It was a long time to sort of hang around and do nothing about this. If you were a British or an American national at that point, you were in fact interned in a camp and treated poorly. I'm not suggesting that the Jews fared any better. It was no picnic to live in Hongqiu when you had to get permission to go in and out of the pass gate. If you worked in the rest of the city, you still had to get permission, etc. There were many restrictions on life, but they were not put in concentration camps, and they were not murdered, as they certainly would have been had they stayed in Europe. So it all worked out for them in the end. Anyway, it's a very peculiar relationship that these two groups had, but it certainly profited the Jewish refugees in the end.
It did. I find it interesting comparing Shanghai to Singapore during the war because I didn't know. I mean, one of the reasons I love to read, fiction, historical fiction and crime fiction and all, there was a book your publisher published sometime this year, the name which, of course, I can't remember, that pointed out that the reason that the Japanese were easily able to take over Kuala Lumpur and Malaysia and all was that the British were a naval power. And so all of their defenses were facing out towards the sea. Everything was geared up to an attack by the Navy. And the Japanese rode bicycles down and were able to penetrate these places by arriving by land. And the British couldn't turn their, armaments and everything around fast enough.
It was behind the city was impenetrable jungle, it was thought.
Yeah.
But the Japanese managed to penetrate it.
They did.
And came up from behind.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I find, it's all, I wonder, you don't know the answer to this, and neither do I, but I've often wondered if the Japanese understood. America did not declare war on Nazi Germany. After Pearl Harbor, I think many of us think that we turned around and declared war on Germany, but we didn't. Hitler declared war on America, and various studies have shown that that was perhaps one of his major mistakes, was that, if he hadn't done that, that we had such an isolationist movement here that we might have stayed out of the war in Europe and focused mostly on the war in the Pacific, but we didn't have any choice.
But of course, we'll never know.
No. But I just think it's, I bet 95% of Americans think that after Pearl Harbor we declared war on both sides, but that's just not true.
No, Hitler made one of his mistakes, as they say.
Well,
but huge mistakes.
Yeah, Russia was the other. And you probably don't know a book, or maybe you've seen it, a book by Graham Moore called The Wealth of Shadows.
I do know it.
Did I send it to you?
Yes.
I thought so. Aha. I wanted Joe to know it. I didn't know if you'd had time to read it yet. But his whole economic theory, I found completely fascinating that a German economist, because the German economy, was just flattened by the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, that he was able to resurrect it by basically creating a war machine. And that I've never understood until I read this book or even figured out, why would Hitler have declared war on Russia? And yet it may be that because they had to keep declaring war to keep this economy going, that it was kind of an inevitable step.
As a matter of fact, I have the book with me on this tour because
I want you to read it.
So I'm now going to. Now I should have read it before I got to the store. And
well, that's okay. The other part that I find really fascinating, it's not a spoiler at all, is that he pointed out that there were some really serious anti-Semitic members of the State Department from southern states that actually are what prevented the state agreeing to let Jewish refugees into the United States. That there's documentary evidence that they basically buried information about concentration camps and all the reasons why they should have let. He actually identifies one of them.
It's a really shaming period in American
No
history. I
kidding.
mean, the State Department, which was very long on old boy wasps and was notoriously anti-Semitic, really prevented lots of people from coming from Europe who had applied. There was a rescue committee to get famous artists and intellectuals out of Europe, and they met with such pushback by state that they finally had to go to and ask Eleanor Roosevelt to intervene personally,
Right.
to allow these internationally famous artists who were only going to adorn the society that would take them. But no, and boats were turned around.
Yeah.
A lot of stamps that said not admitted came in, and this was simply one of those facts of life about the State Department. Later corrected to some extent, but this was the moment when goodwill was needed and open doors. But the question then for me was, what did they find when these people got to Shanghai? And
Right.
the reason that I finally decided to do the book and got really involved in the book is not because I wanted to write the history about the French concession or how the Opium War started, this and that. I mean, that's something that we want to do in 2 to 4 minutes. But it's that Shanghai itself at this point, because it had this reputation of being fast and loose, because it had been a magnet for con men and swindlers and reinvention. People would just get off a boat and say, "My name is Nathan Green," and they were. Who was to say no? And there were assorted bad hats that it would draw to itself. The net result of all of that history, is that it became a byword for vice. I mean, you would have to go to a place like Weimar, Berlin, or Chicago in the 20s to find this kind of gangster culture that was existing everywhere. It was a city of enormous contrasts in wealth. You would get very chic young Chinese girls who were in those wonderful silk dresses.
Chong Chom or whatever they're called.
Yes,
Yep.
that were slid up the side. On the other hand, there were children eating garbage. There were Art Deco movie palaces that are playing Gone with the Wind the year that our characters arrived.
1938.
1938
That's
and
right.
39. So it was, there are the movie theaters, but on the other hand, there were also people living in sampans so poor that if somebody dies, they put them in a paper coffin and float them down the river out to sea so that the sea will swallow them up. They couldn't afford a burial. This kind of contrast inevitably leads to a criminal situation, and Shanghai just had it covered. And it sounds odd to say it's fun to write about, but it is fun to write about. There is something about vice that is ultimately enticing as well as corrupting. And there was something for everybody in Shanghai. There were a lot of sailors off the boats that had money in their pockets that were looking for a good time. There were a lot of bachelor traders working for Jardine Matheson who were making money like they never had before. And they were looking for a good time. And everybody found it. They were either in Blood Alley, where the dive bars are filled with sailors, so-called because they would cause a lot of blood when they beat each other up. There was also Ciro's on Bubbling Well Road, which was like a Fred and Ginger set, and the whole thing was moderne. The Cathay Hotel had a tower suite kind of dance club, nightclub. There was, at the dog tracks, there was a ballroom that might have the Manila Rhythm Boys, and Joe Fenner, who had come from Vienna and was an exhibition dancer, became the Ziegfeld of Shanghai, and with his Paramount Peaches would do wonderful floor shows. I mean, this stuff was just great. And the more I got into it and the more I became fascinated by it, the more I realized that Shanghai's nightlife and its pervasive vice was actually an important leg in this story. First, we have the desperate people coming in from Europe in this very one-off kind of diaspora. Then we have this extraordinary nightlife and corrupt entertainment business. I mean, our protagonist is the nephew of somebody who's in the nightclub business. and he's being groomed to run it, and he's good at it, but that in itself raises a lot of interesting questions. Meanwhile, some of the other people on the boat are headed down in a downward spiral because in this kind of society one does. But it also led to something which I think of as the third leg to this stool. That I think Shanghai is about what happens when these things come together. The desperate refugees, this corrupting nightlife scene, which was essentially like a Jimmy Cagney movie, because what had begun to happen while the Jews were arriving is that instead of fleeing Shanghai with the Japanese looming over everything, the Shanghailanders, which is how they referred to themselves, were more committed than ever. They just thought it was great, and they, as somebody had used the phrase, they were dancing on the lip of a volcano. They were. It was about to erupt. There was about to be a terrifying world war. But until that happened, they were at nightclubs. They were spending this easy money that they were making. They couldn't give it up. And what turns all of this into more significance than a Jimmy Cagney movie. It wasn't just about gangsters. It's often said that crime and politics are two sides of the same coin, or at least fellow travelers. And Shanghai took this to a whole other level. This was no longer just a metaphor in Shanghai. It really was the same people often doing the same things. The most famous example of this is that when Chiang Kai-shek, who was running the, quote, national government, was still in Shanghai in the late 20s. This was before he went off into exile in the western part of the country. He was locked into this fatal battle with Mao, with the communists, and much more interested in that aspect of civil war than he was in defeating the Japanese. And he went to Big-eared Du, which is, I mean, I can't make this stuff up. This is a real figure, who ran the Green Gang. The Green Gang consisted of thousands of gangsters under Du's control. And Chiang went to him and Du controlled the opium business trade into central China. And Chiang went to him and said, I will call off our people. Your business is yours. We will leave you alone. But I want you to take care of the communists for me. I can't go on fighting them and getting anywhere without this. And Du said, done. And proceeded to kill, it is estimated, upwards of 10,000 communists in Shanghai, which eliminated the communist threat in Shanghai for many years for Chiang and started the party on its road up to Yan'an in the north, where it was going to be separated out. This is an amazing piece of history which is documented, and I found it extraordinary. You know, it's the sort of thing where I don't make it up. In fact, I don't use it. I just refer to it as somebody believes that this could have happened. But that's not the story here. It beggars plausibility that you would do it, particularly when Chiang launched a moral crusade against drugs with the help of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who made this one of her signature things. And while Big Du was doing all the things that he needed to do for Chiang, Chiang set up a new commission to look into the venal drug trade and the opium business, and it would investigate and bring to justice the people who were doing all of this. He appointed as chairman of this new committee Big-eared Du. So Big-eared Du was now in charge of investigating himself, with what results you can imagine. And this is not atypical. It became typical of the kind of warp and woof of crime and political activity that existed in Shanghai at the time. It finally gets down to how this affects all of our characters. And there is, I think, always a great question about what's the final line you would cross before you become someone else, or before you violate whoever you want yourself to be. And in this particular instance, that line becomes, what line do you cross if you commit murder? When is it just Is it ever a justified political act? Are there moments when it would actually be the right thing to do? Or what do you do when there's no right thing to do? What if it's just for personal motivations? What if it's clouded and a little mixed up and some of both? What do you do? I won't tell you what the character does, but that's partly why I think that these backstories, and we've sort of gone on to, I've rattled on about these, but I think the backstories are essentially the building blocks of how you create this kind of book, so that the front story can act out for the reader.
Well said. I think we ought to remember, too, we did an event for a fantasy set in Shanghai last Wednesday by Rosalie Lim, which I thought was a really interesting book, also in the 1930s Shanghai. And again, one of the things that we don't really remember, although my parents remembered it well, was how prevalent nightclubs and ballroom dancing were to the whole world at that point. And, you know, it was, you know, today it's Taylor Swift, but in those days, you know, you would go to, like, if you were in Chicago, you would go to the Avalon Ballroom, right? That was a really big thing. And because of that, it powered a lot of these nightclubs and so forth that, and it wasn't just Shanghai. I mean, it was a worldwide
Absolutely.
thing.
There's also a wonderful feedback loop phenomenon with Hollywood, where you're going out to clubs that look
Right.
like clubs you see in the Hollywood movies,
Fred and
because
Ginger.
they have in fact recreated some of these
Yeah.
clubs, you know, and back and forth. I think it's true. There was no television. I mean, it's hard for us to remember this. And there was the radio to listen to. But if you had any money at all, you went out. People went out a lot. It wasn't the
Right.
kind of...
And you also, you know, you needed to have some skills. It wasn't like you always just went to the movies and sat in the audience. If you went to one of these nightclubs or ballroom dancing, you actually had to know how to do that. You know, so it was a little more participatory than it's like Marshall McLuhan. You know, we could get
Yes.
into a whole discussion about the medium as the message, but let's not do that. So let's talk about. I've looked him up 3 times because my memory is so terrible. Also, I've been drinking. And the name of the protagonist is Daniel. I know everybody laughs, but it's true. They gave me a to-go cup at the restaurant and said I could pretend it was coffee, but it's actually Sauvignon Blanc with ice. So Daniel Orr is our protagonist. And one of the most interesting things I think about the structure of this book is that there are really 2 antagonists in this story. One of them is the more obvious one, Colonel Yamada. But in fact, the principal antagonist, I think, for Daniel is Daniel. He is, in many ways, you know, the person he's fighting the most against in this book.
He's got to decide who he's going to be. This isn't as conventional as the angel and the devil on either shoulder, but he's going to have to make some choices. He's given options that a lot of other people aren't. I mean, look, in real life, most of the people who made this trip they were talking about, and, you know, effectively, once the war started, the boat stopped running, and so it was over. They led very conventional lives. They survived the war. They raised kids. They formed soccer clubs. They did the best they could with what they had. They made their way. There were some people for whom being in Shanghai just was something they couldn't ever deal with. When we were talking before about what did they see and these people that have now just sailed halfway across the world, they get off at the riverfront of one of these piers. It's all the hurly-burly, etc., etc. But they are immediately herded by the local charities, because they are now wards of charity. They have no money at all, and very little mechanisms to get a job to do it. They would eventually, but they would first have to be taken care of. So most of them were met by the charities that were set up to greet them and loaded into the backs of trucks. There are photographs of these people being herded into trucks that look uncannily like people being herded into trucks or railway cars during the Holocaust. And you can see this, just the bewilderment and horror on their faces. They are then taken to these charity dormitories called Haima, which is German for homes. But they weren't homes. What they were these barracks um, that often would, these are people who had been in a big villa on the Ringstrasse or came from really substantial means. It was who could afford these ocean liner tickets except someone who could afford them. And now they're consigned to this barracks bed with the bathroom is down the hall and maybe is just a pail in the hallway. Some people couldn't get past it. Some people never left the Heimat and were in effect destroyed by this trip. But most of them didn't. Most of them did, in fact, not only survive the war, but go on to America or Australia or Britain or any of the places of choice that they had wanted to go to in the first place. And their story is a kind of success story. But naturally, one is always interested in the ones that didn't follow the conventional path. That what happened to them. And besides, it was just too much fun to write about the show business. The photographs are wonderful. There are these wonderful pictures of chorus girls on board ship who were in kick lines and rehearsing, and you realize that there's just this whole almost vaudevillian circuit in Asia that goes from Yokohama to Manila to Hong Kong to Shanghai and Canton. And if you were somebody in show business, you had signed on for the trip. And this was your week in Shanghai, and you did your shows, and you got on with it. I found all that completely gripping because I just had no idea that it existed before.
So this book is really more about the destination, but I think you also have to really pay attention to the journey to get there. So Daniel, from Berlin, has to go to Trieste. Now I have been to Trieste only once, and it was an international, if I recall, for a long time. It didn't really belong to any particular nation. It was kind of a international. It's where Italy joins Croatia, isn't it? Slovenia and Croatia and Italy. So it's on if you're looking at a map and you go up the Italian boot, and if you look at the right, that's Trieste and that little kind of crevice there. It's a fascinating city. When you drive to it from Ljubljana, you drop down. There's this really sort of scary, like the Corniche on the Riviera. You drive down very steeply to get to the bottom. And that's where Daniel boards his ship, where these refugees are going. And really, it's the voyage on the ship that shapes so much of him and who he becomes. There's the Japanese colonel I've mentioned. There's some other people, but there is a woman. And so in most Joe Kanon stories, there is sort of a love story. It doesn't always go well, but anyway, there is a woman on this ship, and that becomes an important. So while you're on a ship, traveling for what was it, like 2 weeks?
2 to 3 weeks.
Right,
Yeah.
you're in a bubble, and that ship and the people on that ship and the culture of the ship become a whole world for you and can really shape relationships. And so Daniel meets this woman on the ship along with other people, and that shapes what happens to him in Shanghai.
And indeed, what happens to her?
Yes. Well, I wasn't going to touch on what happens to her, but anyway, yeah, it does. So, there's this book does not start in Shanghai. In other words, a lot of the book is about the journey, and the relationships that are formed to get to Shanghai, and then what happens when those relationships are tested or broken or whatever, or strengthened by what they meet.
Yeah, very much so. Trieste used to be the port for the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
So that, how in The Sound of Music, he's actually in the Navy, even though he's in Bavaria. But it turns out that they had some boats in Trieste. I'm a great believer in love stories in books. I think that nothing reveals us so much about ourselves, our character, as our intimacies and how we deal with them. It also, many of my books to me are movies that are made in my head, And one of the things that
If only you'd made the
if,
German yourself.
if only I'd done it myself,
Right.
but we mustn't say.
No, well, I can say it, right?
Yeah, you can.
You can't.
Right. It's. I believe in that. I think that it adds to the story that it. This is a man who had been politically active. He was in the resistance in Germany, in Berlin, and when he is lucky enough to get out and lucky enough not to be caught, nobody gives his name away. He is clean. He gets on this boat in Trieste, and he truly is beginning a whole new life. But you never outrun yourself. And what begins to happen in that phase of the book that I describe as when crime and politics merge and do the same thing is that he finds himself again in a political situation and has to make some decisions about what he really wants to do and what he believes in. So, yes, he is this antagonist of the protagonist is in the same person, all caught up in the same character. I hope with great complication. I once had a friend who said to me, well, congratulations, you've finally written a book in which there isn't a single sympathetic character. And I said, gee, that's funny. I loved everybody in the book. I thought they were all kind of complicated and mixed up in an interesting way. I still think that. I think that nobody's all one thing or another.
No,
so
but you
want
really
them.
like ethical dilemmas. I mean, that's always been a big part of your books, is that no one person, as you say, is all one thing, you know.
Right.
And
How do we make the moral choices that we make?
And
you
that's
know?
probably why you set most of them in wartime, right? Because that's when the highest stressors actually appear.
And everything is highlighted and more deeply serious. Somebody once said to me, why do you write about the immediate post-war period? Obviously, I don't just write about that period, but I did write a few books. And I said, because everything takes on an aura of importance then. It's one of those periods in history where it's a real hinge. Things are going to change profoundly, and decisions are going to be made by people just like us, not extraordinary people, but just people that you know. And these decisions are going to affect lives for the next half century, for the next 50 years. It is therefore inherently dramatic. You know, what was it like to run the American occupation of Germany in 1945? How did you feel about what you were doing there? I wanted to know. It began with Los Alamos. I mean, we grew up under that mushroom cloud. We were the generation with nuclear baggage that hid under desks because we were in a drill. Who were the guys that put that mushroom cloud there? What were they thinking about? What did it mean to them? How could one not want to know? I did. I thought it was interesting. So the period, once you open that door, there are just so many rich things to discover that I kind of stayed with it. But I have, in fact, written books that go a little later. I think the most recent book in our chronological time was 1962 in not leaving Berlin, but in the Berlin Exchange. And my wife says that if I just keep going, I may one day write a contemporary novel, because you can just go from 62
No
on.
choice.
But I
No
don't think I
chance.
will.
And, you know, actually, is this the first non-Eurocentric, so to speak, book that you haven't really delved a lot into the Asian theater? There's an author named James R. Ben, whose books I love, if you've read the Billy Boyle books, and he'll be with us in September on the 7th. I actually know what day of the week. It's a Saturday. I know, isn't that amazing? I can tell you what day of the week it is in November on particular dates. But the only time that he has left Europe is that he did send Billy Boyle on a mission with JFK was in whatever the boat it was.
PT 109.
Thank you. Yeah, the PT 109 thing. But I think, you know, much of the literature of World War II is Eurocentric and, you know, not so much. And I'm never entirely sure why. Maybe it's a lack of sources. Maybe it's a cultural thing, you know.
I think also it was
a lot of
closed to us for so long. I think,
Maybe.
You know, it's...
You remember the bridge on the River Kwai?
Yeah.
I mean, who could forget Alec Guinness in that amazing role, you know? And I had my uncle, his war service was actually on the hump. He was a Russian speaker from Columbia. I mean, he was American, but he'd studied Russian at Columbia. And when he was drafted, they sent him to Nepal, I guess, or where it was anyway, where the planes were
Right.
flying supplies into China over the Himalayas. Um, he never, you
Which is
know,
a brutal mission.
it was
It was,
very
yeah.
brutal. But I thought that the movie, the River Kwai, reminded us, and there's an Australian movie too about what it was like for the people. It wasn't just the Germans who had war camps, or
Right.
were brutal to prisoners and so forth. And really, in a way, some of what you were talking about, there were Japanese Americans who were put into the kind of situation that you're talking about, that the refugees, when they got to China,
Right.
were put into. There's an author named Naomi Hirahana who has written a couple of great books. Evergreen is the second one. I never can remember the name of the first one. What is it? Clark and Division. Yeah, Clark and Division. Truly a remarkable book. And amazingly, that internment was in Chicago, right off Navy Pier. When
Uh-huh.
I, who grew up there, never knew that there was a whole Japanese internment colony right there in the middle of Chicago. So even we, did Americans, interned Americans in camps like that.
Indeed. There's a lot more to come from Asia, I think. No question about it. And particularly as Asia itself becomes more and more important in our lives and in our consciousness, there there needs to be more information, more
There
stories.
does. There's a book called House of Doors. I don't know if any of you read it, but it's set in Malaysia. But I thought that one of the really great strengths of the book is it talks about, for a long, this is Somerset Maugham in it, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. But Sun Yat-sen is trying to raise money and raise awareness for his effort to, um, overthrow the Chinese government, the last of the
Yes.
dynasties. And, we don't know much about, I mean, I learned more reading that book about Sun Yat-sen in his early years than, I ever knew before. That's a great thing about historical fiction, is that you get to learn stuff, but you're still getting a good story, so you don't feel like you're studying a history book.
There is also a greater variety that needs come out. For a long time, American sources of information about China, at least culturally, were essentially in control of the children of missionaries. Henry Luce being the most famous of all of them, but Pearlbuck and people like that were all of families of Christian missionaries, and their take on China was their take on China. I will not quarrel with them. This is whatever experience they thought they knew and could apply. That's their business. But there are many ways of looking at this, and we didn't for a long time. We just bought the package and said this is what it was like. The fact that Chiang's government was hopelessly corrupt, that he was not really participant in the war that he was being supplied for as much as he might have been, is something that the American military complained about, but then they were shushed by other people for a variety of reasons. And this is a controversy we don't need to go into here. It doesn't matter. But the point that I was making is that there is so much to learn about this. We are much better informed about Europe. We are much better informed about the German war than we are about the Pacific. And it was the hinge of what we're living through now. Who would at all deny that knowing what happened in China in the last 50 years is crucial to going on to the next 50 years? So even though this is a book with a lot of nightclubs and people having a great time, I hope, it also is supposed to be looking at a piece of history that, how did the Chinese feel about it? This story is told from the point of view of Westerners and the expats who were living there. But what's perfectly clear is that the Chinese are looking around and seeing people who are just suppressing them and taking advantage with their little trade concessions, putting people to work for no money, being responsible for a lot of inequality and a lot of bad stuff that's going on. Those things are not easily forgotten and may well be baked into the cultural differences that we're having to contend with now. If that's the case, it's as well to know about them, or otherwise we're just walking around blind. We really ought to understand the history better. I would like to anyway. There's a lot more to read, and some of
Which,
it's fun.
which leads me to my final question before we ask the audience. So I know how long it takes a book to come to publication, which means that the author has got months, if not a year, to be writing something else. So since you frequently have a book on the boil, in fact, the entire time I've known you, you've had a book on the boil. What is currently your next writing project?
Well, I have to. I said we'd have a dozen books at least, right? So
Mhm.
we'll do that. I'm always afraid of talking it out. I'm certainly staying in Asia.
Ah, that was sort of the question.
I, I, these things go in waves, and that's just what's fascinated me at the moment. And I think we'll just move further up the coast and look a little more closely at Japan.
Okay. Sounds great. I love it. Right. So, how about questions from any of you? Yes, sir.
Although you talk about staying in Asia, I think one of my favorite books, and I've read all of them, I love them all, is Stardust, where you concentrate on, if I remember correctly, because I read it several years ago, the anti-Semitism and the McCarthy period and how it affected the movie industry. That seems almost like an outlier with respect to the nature generally of the books you write about. Is it, or is there a connection I'm not focusing on?
It's partly an outlier, and people have mentioned that. It's also a book I'm fond of. You know the way you're fond of a child that misbehaves all the time and isn't quite turning out the
puppy.
way you had hoped, or a puppy, right? It's certainly what the book is about Hollywood in the late 40s and how this extraordinary studio system, which worked so beautifully for so many years, just fell apart. Partly because of the incursion of the McCarthy era and the witch hunts that were being led there, which form a big part of the book. But initially, what got me interested in this, it's a book about Los Angeles, but what fascinated me were the German refugees and the emigres who had come over and settled in Hollywood, partly because the weather was good and it was cheaper to live there. That seems implausible now, but it was once true that it was much cheaper than New York. And there might be some work in the movies. So you got a lot of people who were, what I felt was dramatic, were people who felt that they had escaped with the last remnants of Western culture. Alma Mahler came carrying one of Bruckner's symphonies written down in a suitcase. And these were composers and authors and actors and artists and architects, I mean, people in the arts. And they're all stashed away in the Hollywood Hills, and nobody has any idea they're there. They don't feature in the current landscape at all, because the current landscape is, well, what are the grosses on the Betty Grable movie? Or, they've just escaped with their lives from Nazi-controlled Europe. And all of a sudden there are swimming pools and orange juice and palm trees, and it's completely disorienting. So there is a kind of thread that runs through some of these books, which is not just the plight, but the complexity of what emigres discover when they fetch up somewhere else. And it's about the movies. I think anybody who's read a few of my books know that movies are in the background always. They just sort of infuse the way, the books, I think, are constructed in scenes, and certainly they're very heavy on dialogue. This has been pointed out to me as a criticism, but I don't care. It's the way I like to write it. And I think dialogue is important. The minute somebody opens his mouth, I think he begins to define character. And it's, to me, much more effective than saying he had a long aquiline nose and close-set eyes. And what does that mean? I don't know. But listen to people talk, and you will begin to understand who they are. So it is an outlier, but like all orphans, it's beloved. I like that book. Thank you.
So it sounds like they're in your books. I had not read any. Barbara basically wrote to me and said, "You need to come on Monday because you're really going to love this guy." So that's why I'm here. Um, but it sounds to me like that there's a tension between a belief that, sort of bring ourselves wherever we go, but also profound disorientation. I mean, literally taking someone out of one world and dropping them into something completely foreign. Is that sort of true for all of your books? I mean, is that a...
Yes. Um, in fact, that maybe is a more lyrical way of putting it than I've ever put it.
She's quite a good historical novelist, so you can pay attention.
I once described it, I thought that all books, in a sense, followed the old narrative arc of a Western. And I used it, in fact, in Stardust, the book about the movies, where each section has a different intro. And section 1 is a man rides into town.
A stranger
This-
comes
a
to town.
stranger
Right.
comes to town. Then what happens? Ambush, setup. There are just these kind of conventional tent poles that can get the story from one place to the next. And they all have to do with someone being dropped into a culture not his or her own, and how they fare in that culture, but how that culture impinges on them. What effect, what is Shanghai going to do to these people? Some of them it destroys, some of them, if not ennobled, are at least richer for the experience, etc. I find that utterly fascinating.
Do you think that would have been true for people who were dropped into Las Vegas?
I think it's true now. You go to Las Vegas and you go, wow. I think, in fact, every time, I have been to Vegas a few times, and every time I go, for the first night, I imagine myself as a European tourist seeing it for the first time. And because it's so easy to say, only in America could you find this. I don't know that that's true, by the way. I think you can find it some other places. But the sheer outfrontedness of that place is just amazing. I don't know that there's anywhere in Europe, certainly, that's like it. And consequently, it becomes, if not freakish, at least completely fascinating if you're trying to understand this country. It's like, what do we think we're doing when we're out there, quote, enjoying ourselves in quite this way?
It's interesting you use the word freakish because, I think of putting the Eiffel Tower in Las Vegas as sort of freakish. It's this kind
Right.
of, pulling something out of one world and sticking it in another. But I have a friend who went to Disney outside of Paris and said that was freakish. It's an American thing that's
Yes.
slumped right into and they said it's not French. It doesn't feel French. It feels
Right.
American.
And of course, the big one in China.
Yeah.
But that's, I must say, when our kids were small, we took them, and I always felt totally dislocated myself. And, I'm American always, but I think the Disney parks are a world unto themselves.
And currently evolving, at least in Florida.
And growing and growing.
Well, not just that, but they're actually, responding to current cultural concerns and, tearing down some of the rides and redoing them and other things. And, so even in fantasy, there's some evolution to what's going on in the world. Yeah.
Indeed.
Indeed, fascinating. Right. I have resisted going to see the Metropolitan Opera production of Rigoletto set in Las Vegas, and I'm not sure whether Mantua really, makes the jump. But I found it really interesting that the Metropolitan Opera would conceive Las Vegas to be a modern setting for this particular opera. I've never quite worked it out, but why not? Right. Anybody else have a question? No? Patrick, do we have any online questions? Okay. Well, in that case, Joe, anything you'd like to say to sum us up?
Just that I hope you read the book. I found the material among the most interesting that I've ever looked at in writing these books. There's just something intrinsically fascinating to me about this city and indeed that country. And it's going to be so important to us now that we should know something about it. And this would be a very entertaining way of learning something about it, I hope, anyway.
Well, it's certainly volcanic. It's certainly multicultural. It's certainly,
All these good things.
a lot of things that we're looking at today. Immigration questions that are so hot, cultural norms being, redefined or strengthened, or however you want to look at it. So I'm really interested. I wondered if you were in fact going to stay in Asia. I kind of guessed that you would after doing this, because undoubtedly there's some overlap for what you looked at
It's
in
just-
Shanghai.
It's just too interesting not to go back.
Right.
It's,
So I like the idea we're going for 12, right?
Okay.
We're going to go for 12. We're
It's-
going to
it's a
stick
deal.
together to go to 12,
It's a
right?
deal. All right.
Okay, I love it. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. Let's give Joe a round of applause. And I'll remind everybody that this is the day before publication day. So if you have a book, you should really get it dated. That will make it even more fun. So good night, everybody.